So this is a dark novel. There's a lot of physical child abuse, particularly in the early chapters. Usually when Wackford Squeers appears. He mentions slavery, and he's basically racist, makes a racist comment in chapter 9. He says a slave driver in the West Indies is allowed a man under him to see that his blacks don't run away or get up a rebellion, and I'll have a man under me to do the same with our blacks, till such time as little Wackford is able to take charge of the school. So he wants to run his school like a slave plantation. Very nasty man. In chapter 38, paying hitman to kill people is mentioned. Lord Mulberry Hawk wishes that Britain has a flawed justice system like some other flawed country. Otherwise, he would pay for Nicholas to be murdered. Dickens mentions that the two aristocrats as being corrupt and indulgent in a bad way. Both in chapter 50, Dickens says, both utterly heartless, both men upon town, both thoroughly initiated into its worst vices, both deeply in debt, both fallen from some higher estate, both addicted to every depravity for which society can find some genteel name, and plead its most depraving conventionalities as an excuse. It's got murder in it, chapter 50. Lord Mulberry Hawk basically falls out with his, I think it's like his younger friend, Lord Verysoft. There's a duel in the woods, chapter 50, and Lord Mulberry kills his associate and tells them his other associates to go and get rid of the body. In chapter, I think it's chapter 2, there is an account of, well, it's not just cash for questions, it's literally a massive company, the United Metropolitan Improved Hot Muffin and Crumpet Baking and Punctual Delivery Company, basically buy off a politician to back them up in English Parliament, so that, I think it's so that they have a monopoly, or certainly so they can thrive. It's quite a lengthy account of this process. It's actually quite humorous, but underneath it's not humorous, is it really? There's kidnap, Squeers steals Smike in London. More on that later, because it relates to one of the myths. Dickens basically, as ever, talks about the massive wealth inequality and terrible working conditions. In chapter 50, he mentions how the gypsy kids at the race course, his phrase not mine, are sunburnt and healthier and not deformed like the kids who work dark long hours in British industrial sweatshops. That's chapter 50. Just trying to scroll this. There's prisons for people in debt. Chapter 17, young timid Kate goes for a job in a milliner's. The girls work 12 hours a day, and I believe that there is no wages if they are sick. Wages are deducted for the ill. Dickens mentions the girls who work in the milliners as, in chapter 17, as many sickly girls whose business, like that of the poor worm, is to produce with patient toil the finery that bedecks the thoughtless and luxurious, traverse our streets, making towards the scene of their daily labour, and catching as if by stealth in their hurried walk the only gasp of wholesome air and glimpse of sunlight which cheer their monotonous existence during the long train of hours that make a working day. Okay, that's chapter 17. It also has workplace harassment, which is allowed to thrive in that same place of work where Kate works. The other girls, the team leader, Miss Nag, does not like her, and she's allowed to sort of harass Kate and get away with it. The major theme of the novel is rich, quote-unquote, powerful villains threatening to use their power and influence to hurt ordinary, defenseless people. There's suicide, which I'm sure many of the readers will be pleased with, because it's Ralph Nickleby who kills himself. He is like a Scrooge-like character. He does a lot of sneering throughout the novel, and Dickens, I think it's in one of the early chapters, he mentions that someone is not an ill-conditioned wretch who sneers at the life matrimonial. I get the impression that's aimed at Ralph, so he's a sort of like a single, miserable guy who was married once when he was younger, but he kept it secret. So basically there's a lot of the usual Dickens stuff about dysfunctional institutions that allow injustice and evil to prevail. Chapter 53. Nicholas contemplates in hopelessness as he walks through the streets, of London, how crafty avarice grew rich, and manly honest hearts were poor and sad. It's, as I say, Nicholas, Kate and the Nickleby family are very troubled most of the time in this novel, until they meet a particular pair of twins. More on this later. So where is the mythology in this novel? Well, in this dark novel full of crimes and horrible things, like any Greco-Roman myth. Well, first off, the terms misfortune and fortune crop up a lot, obviously, almost like this is a 65 chapter analysis of those terms. And as Tristan says from the YouTube channel Tristan and the Classics, if you annotate a great work of fiction, you sort of slow down, make notes, do your own little synopsis every 3 chapters and look for the some kind of hidden message underneath. Usually around the middle of the novel you have an aha experience where you see what the author's really indicating, where you see what the author's really getting at in his work. Particularly pay attention to any passages of chapter where there is an ethereal undercurrent. To me, this happens in chapter 35, and I'll explain why. It's where Nicholas meets the Mr. Is it Cheeryble? I'll say Cheeryble. Just a couple of other points. In chapter 29, the god Jupiter is actually referenced by one of the actors, Mr. Fowler. "Jupiter!" exclaimed Mr. Fowler. "What an unsophisticated shepherd you are." He's talking to Nicholas at that stage. And in chapter 23, the same character, Mr. Fowler, says, "Yes, by Jove, and well I may," said Mr. Fowler, drowning his arms through his and walking him up and down the stage. Just a couple of little references there. In the original illustrations that came with the book, I believe that it was published in a newspaper, and there were some illustrations that I can see on a particular website. The Goddess Fortuna is shown. It gives us gives us a big clue to see where Dickens was heading. So, we have stated this is a dark novel where the Nickleby family are in some they're in grave danger generally. Uncle Ralph has allowed Kate to be groomed by an evil aristocrat, Lord Mulberry Hawk. He hints to the Lord that Kate, who is timid and beautiful and quite young, is friendless and helpless. Uncle Ralph schemed to get her unemployed brother, who was protective of her, out of the way. He swindled him into taking a teaching job 200 miles north in some hellhole of a sham boarding school, which is Dothmore House, run by a sadistic loon tune called Wackford Squeers. So Nicholas, he's young and delusional. He thinks he's gonna be teaching the children of the aristocracy. So his naivety is taken advantage of by his horrible uncle, who was a powerful banker. Mulberry Hawk is dangerous, as stated earlier. Dickens describes him as depraved. Don't forget, he also murders his associate, and he also says that he wants Nicholas dead after they have a skirmish in a coach. So he's seriously contemplating having Nicholas killed. So there's a lot of danger that the Nickleby family are in. Chapter 19, Kate says, when she's alone with Mulberry Hawk, "I wish you to understand, sir," said Kate, trembling in spite of herself, but speaking with great indignation, "that your behaviour offends and disgusts me. If you have a spark of gentlemanly feeling remaining, you will leave me." He in fact goes on to forcibly detain her. She breaks free and he falls on the floor. That's when Uncle Ralph comes in, but don't forget, Uncle Ralph is happy to use Kate, young Kate, who's timid, she's attractive. He basically uses her as a pawn on a chessboard, even after this. So Nicholas defends mentally challenged boy Smike when Squeers is about to give Smike a serious beating. Nicholas interferes, beats Squeers up, and he and Smike go on to escape and basically go on foot down to London from Yorkshire. Uncle Ralph gets to hear about this and he wants to use his quote-unquote power and influence to have his nephew hanged. He sees that as an opportunity to legitimately see him off. So Nicholas secretly makes it back to London with his friend Smike. They are living in London in Newman Noggs's apartment. He is Ralph Nickleby's clerk, and basically he hates his boss Ralph, and with good reason. In the apartment below there's a family called the Kenwicks, and they entertain a civil servant who is highly regarded. He collects water rates, and more on this later, as I think it's quite significant. So, chapter 35. To me, there is definite ethereal undercurrents in this chapter. Long story short, Nicholas is unemployed, and he goes to the Victorian equivalent of the job centre to look for work. Chapter 35 as follows: the same magnificent estates for the investment of capital, and the same enormous quantities of capital to be invested in the state, and in short, the same opportunities of all sorts of people, all sorts for people who wanted to make their fortunes. So, as Nicholas stops to look at the window, an old gentleman happens to stop too, and Nicholas, carrying his eye along the window panes from left to right in search of some capital text placard which should be applicable to his own case, caught sight of this old gentleman's figure, and instinctively withdrew his eyes from the window to observe the same more closely. Dickens continues with: but what principally attracted the attention of Nicholas was the old gentleman's eye. Never was such a clear, twinkling, honest, merry, happy eye as that, and there he stood, looking a little upward, with one hand thrust into the breast of his coat, and the other playing with his old-fashioned gold watch chain, his head thrown a little to one side, and his hat a little more on one side than his head. But that was evidently accident, not his ordinary way of wearing it. With such a pleasant smile playing about his mouth, and such a comical expression of mingled slyness, simplicity, kind-heartedness, and good humour lighting up his jolly old face, that Nicholas would have been content to have stood there and looked at him until evening, and to have forgotten meanwhile that there was such a thing as a soured mind or a crabbed countenance to be met with in the whole world. Dickens goes on: still the old gentleman stood there, glancing from placard to placard, and Nicholas could not forbear raising his eyes to his face again. Grafted upon the quaintness and oddity of his appearance was something so indescribably engaging, and bespeaking so much worth, and there were so many little lights hovering about the corners of his mouth and eyes, that it was not a mere amusement, but a positive pleasure and delight to look at him. This being the case, it is no wonder that the old man caught Nicholas in the fact more than once. At such times Nicholas coloured and looked embarrassed, for the truth is that he had begun to wonder whether the stranger could by any possibility be looking for a clerk or secretary, and thinking this, he felt as if the old gentleman must know it. So basically, Dickens is really trying to Dickens is dropping hints there that something ethereal is going on. To me, it's clear. This gentleman is Mr. Cheeryble, who is a financially powerful merchant. He's sort of like, well, he's the antithesis of someone like Uncle Ralph, in that this man is happy, jolly, he's content, he's a lovely guy, and he loves to help people who are in danger. He takes Nicholas under his wing. He gets to befriend Kate and the Nickleby family. He's a twin. He has a twin brother, and they have a clerk called Ned Linkinwater. So, I suggest that Dickens is incorporating the myth of the twin sons of the god Zeus, Castor and Pollux, the Dioscuri. They are figures from Greek and Roman mythology, considered the twin sons of Zeus or Jupiter, semi-divine figures. The twins were credited with the role of saving those in trouble at sea or in grave danger in war. So, basically, Zeus and Jupiter are related to wealth, money, fortune, and the goddess Fortuna is the daughter of Zeus and Venus. Dickens seemed to hint that he knows this by calling the clock Linkinwater. Well, what did water have to do with wealth in ancient Rome? Well, pun intended, everything, as the prosperity of agricultural economies relied on water supply. There is also an aspirational sort of buffoon-like figure who's treated like a king by the Kenwicks, who is the highly regarded civil servant who collects the water rates. His name is Mr. Lillyvick. Fortuna is also identified as the god known as Bonus Eventus, who presides with Lympha, 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 who is goddess of the water supply. I think Dickens knew this, and this is why he used the name Linkinwater as the surname of the Cheerybles, clerk and friend. For those who know the novel, you'll know that there's a beautiful young girl whose name is Madeleine Bray. She lives with her sick father, but her he's pretty mean. He doesn't really care too much about her. They live in poverty. In actuality, she's quite wealthy because she owns she has an inheritance coming to her, but she doesn't know. However, evil Ralph and his banker friend Arthur Gride, they actually know, and they plot. They conspire with her father to have her married off to this horrible old banker, who actually states that he will break her spirit, I think is the term that he uses. So yeah, it's pretty oppressive, horrible stuff. And Nicholas is in love with her. He fancies her, he's in love with her. He first met her in the job centre. And he finds out about this plot, this horrible plot, and he tells his friends, the twins, the Cheeryble twins, and they basically go about planning how to rescue this girl, Madeleine. I think Dickens was trying to incorporate the Helen and Theseus myth within this sort of subplot. Castor and Pollux were the gods who rescued Helen from captivity. She was kidnapped by Theseus. So again, I think there's another link there with well, I must add that once Helen was basically rescued, she was taken to Sparta, and it said that she was thronged with suitors. Well, the Cheerybles, after they rescue Madeleine, find a suitable suitor for her. As you know, if you've read the novel, it's the suitor is Nicholas himself, so you know, perhaps Dickens incorporated this intentionally. So initially the god Cronus granted that his 3 sons should control the world. Zeus was given the sky, Poseidon the sea, and Hades the underworld. Okay. Is it not a stretch to say that Wackford Squeers is the Hades in this novel? runs a horrible hellhole up in Yorkshire. I believe, I don't know if he's a farmer, but I think the school is on farmland. So Hades rules the dead, assisted by others over whom he has complete authority. The house of Hades was described as full of guests, though he rarely left the underworld. He cared little about what happened in the world above, as his primary attention was ensuring none of his subjects ever left his domain. Hades strictly forbade his subjects to leave his domain, and would become quite enraged when anyone tried to leave, or if someone tried to steal the souls from his realm. His wrath was equally terrible. I think that Dickens is using Wackford Squeers as a Hades representative, and that Dothmore is the underworld where the dead are. Dickens describes Dothmore as a hellhole of, well, this is my term, as a hellhole of oppression and deceit. In chapter 8 he describes how utterly wretched the boys are, that they are practically half dead. They have pale, haggard faces. I'll quote, "How the last faint traces of hope, the remotest glimmering of any good to be derived from his efforts in the den, faded from the mind of Nicholas as he looked in dismay around. Pale and haggard faces, lank and bony figures, children with the countenance of old men, deformities with irons upon their limbs, boys of stunted growth, and others whose long meagre legs would hardly bear their stooping bodies, all crowded on the view together. They were the bleared-eyed, the hare-lipped, the crooked foot, and every ugliness of distortion that told of unnatural aversion conceived by parents for their offsprings, or of young lives from which the earliest dawn of infancy had been one horrible endurance of cruelty and neglect. Faces which should have been handsome, darkened with the scowl of sullen, dogged suffering, etc. Every young and healthy feeling flogged and starved down with every revengeful passion that can fester in swollen hearts, eating its evil way to the core in silence. What an incipient hell was breeding here." Squeers says, "Let any boy speak a word without leave, and I'll take the skin off his back." So interesting that Hades was furious when one of the denizens of his underworld would escape, and the central part of this novel is when Nicholas takes pity upon Smike when he's about to be beaten because he makes an escape attempt, but then Nicholas and Smike do in fact escape to London, and believe it or not, Wackford Squeers catches up with them and he kidnaps Smike again. So, what has Hades to do with wealth, you are probably thinking, or maybe you already know. Okay, from the Wikipedia, Hades is sort of the dark side of fortune making. Perhaps from fear of pronouncing his name, around the 5th century BC, the Greeks started referring to Hades as Plouton, Plouton. May have pronounced that wrong, I don't know. This has a root meaning of wealthy, considering that the abode below, i.e. the soil, come riches, e.g. fertile crops, metals, and so on. Plouton became the Roman god who both rules the underworld and distributed riches from below. This deity was a mixture of the Greek god Hades and the Eleusinian icon Plutos. Very interesting how it all comes together. The three brothers, Hades and Zeus and Poseidon. However, I haven't mentioned Poseidon yet. I don't think Dickens has a direct reference to Poseidon, but what I must say is that I don't think there's traditionally any hatred between Poseidon and Hades. However, there was perhaps a brotherly conflict of who rules what world. Is Poseidon represented in the novel? Oddly enough, Squeers has an adversary in John Browdy, who is the hearty sort of macho, loud Yorkshireman. He's quite rough, but you know, he's got a big heart. He's happy when Nicholas escapes with Smike. I think he gives them some money to for their travels. He also frees Smike in chapter 39. So the three sons of Cronus were said to have a bit of rivalry. Maybe Dickens is hinting at this in chapter 39. See what you think. I'll quote directly from Dickens. It's the scene where Browdy secretly visits Smike that Squeers has re-kidnapped, and he's holding him in a hotel room. Browdy replied, John, why don't he punch his head or lay theeself down and kick and squeal out for the police? In other words, he's saying to Smike, why didn't you run for it when Squeers grabbed you on the streets of London? I'd have licked a dozen such as him when I was young as thee, but thee beest a poor broken down chap, said John sadly, and God forgive me for bragging o'er Jan o'er his weaker creatures. Thee'll just tell young master, i.e. Nicholas, that I'm spliced to Tilly Price and to be eared on at that Saracen by leather. In other words, he frees Smike. Hope you like the Yorkshire accent attempt now. He frees Smike, and then Dickens says later on, when John is in bed, if there could only have been somebody by to see how the bedclothes shook, and to see the Yorkshireman's great red face and round head appear above the sheets every now and then, like some jovial monster. Note that the term jovial probably refers to the god Jove, who is Jupiter. Like some jovial monster coming to the surface to breathe, and once more dive down convulsed with the laughter which came bursting forth afresh, that somebody would have been scarcely less amused than John Browdy himself. That suggests some kind of submerging from the oceans. I don't know what you think. Maybe it's Poseidon. Is that too much of a stretch? So there you have it. I propose that Dickens consciously, intentionally put these various mythologies into his novel, and as far as I know, I don't think anyone since it was published in 1839, I believe it was, has pointed this out. If I'm wrong, please comment in the sections, and if you liked it or don't like it, well, make a comment and we can discuss it. Okay, thank you, bye now.